In the spirit of the Tholos Circle, where ancient thinkers gather to debate the issues of today, this is Tholos Talks. Through deep insight and thought-provoking dialogue, we offer the tools to decode complexity and illuminate the path forward.
Welcome to Coffee, Trade, and Tech. I'm Jake Jennings, Basilinna Chair of America's Trade and Tech Practice. Today we have Margaret Myers, who recently transitioned from her role as Director of the Asia and Latin America Program at the Inter-American Dialogue to join Johns Hopkins University's Advanced International Studies School. Margaret is a renowned expert on China-Latin America relations, has published extensively on the topic, and recently testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on advancing American interest in the Western Hemisphere. Margaret, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you here with us. Just curious, how did you get started in public policy, much less focusing on Western Hemisphere?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here and to have this conversation. My career trajectory, I think, is maybe a bit unorthodox in that, China-Latin America relations really wasn't a field when I started studying both China and Latin America many, many years ago in undergrad and then in grad school. And so it evolved into a field as I was studying both sort of independently. I remember a few professors saying, please concentrate on one area or the other, one geographical region or the other. And in retrospect, I'm glad I did not because, as it stands right now, the intersection, right, of engagement between China and Asia more broadly and the Latin American and Caribbean regions is of paramount importance, of considerable interest here in the United States, but then also more broadly. It was languages, I think, initially, that really drove my interest in both regions. Spanish and Chinese have been something that I've studied and pursued and tried to, improve over time. And it's through those languages, through, foreign language studies, I became interested also in area studies and was fortunate to be able to study both regions in depth, whether here in the United States through my university engagements, but then also overseas in China, in other parts of Asia and across the Americas.
Yeah, it was fascinating to see that you were a Latin American analyst on the U.S. Department of Defense, and you were even deployed with the Navy. What was that like? And then how did that influence your views of China-Latin America relations?
Yeah, that was I was fortunate to work for the Department of Defense, both as a Latin America analyst and then separately as a China analyst. And so it was really quite interesting to see kind of how DoD engagement with both China and Latin America was carried out at that particular moment in time. What really stood out was the extent of actual engagement and cooperation and activities with Latin American partners, right? It is our security cooperation trainings and activities are expansive. They underpin, a considerable portion of our overall relationship with the region and have been, I think, hugely impactful over time and a critical mechanism through which to continue to engage. Our engagement with China at the time was more extensive than it is now, but certainly was far less of a priority, actual, engagement with the Chinese military then still, right, was far less of a priority than with other parts of the world. What really stood out to me was the strength of these partnerships. And I think in many ways, especially in terms of security cooperation, right, this persists as a critical function and an element of our cooperation across the Americas.
Anything jump out at you or stand out from those trips that you're just like, wow, I can't believe that happened?
I mean, for me personally, there was a lot that stood out from it. It was a great learning experience. And I was very grateful to have had the opportunity, especially, my deployment as a civilian, right, alongside the U.S. Marines in Partnership of the Americas was just amazing. I was able to jump out of helicopters and accompany the Marines on long marches to different places across the Peruvian desert, for example, as they did a number of exercises with the Peruvian Marines and others. I served as an interpreter, which was a fantastic opportunity, and was able to engage with, top brass on the Peruvian side and to understand their thinking about operations, especially in the jungle, but then, broader functions that the military might serve in Peru. So, it was one of those sort of, lifelong transformative experiences that I'm truly so happy to have been a part of.
Wow, that's amazing. And really something you can, ground yourself to as you move forward with, upcoming challenges. Just curious, you were at the Inter-American Dialogue for a while, and then just recently transitioned to Johns Hopkins. What's that been like? And what are you trying to do at Johns Hopkins?
So yeah, I mean, the transition has been a great one. I obviously, I was at the Inter-American Dialogue for 15 years, building a program on Asia, Latin America, but really with 90% of that focused on China's engagement with the region. And so that was a truly transformative and excellent experience, and one that I'll value, always, and that has helped to cultivate my understanding over time of, the intricacies and wide-ranging factors that influence the China-Latin America dynamic. This transition was one that I made because I think it's critical to look, in some cases, beyond the Latin American region to understand what China is doing globally. There is tremendous value, and we were beginning to do this at the dialogue as well, in doing comparative analysis, right, to understand what are the differences in Chinese engagement with Latin America and Africa, for instance, or Latin America and Southeast Asia. What lessons can be derived from China's longstanding engagement with regions on its periphery, right, and then those that are further afield, such as the Latin American region, which is the furthest from China, right, and is the newest sort of relationship in terms of, when China actually went out to different places. And so this opportunity at SAIS as managing director of the Institute for America, China, and the Future of Global Affairs will allow us to look in a little bit more depth at kind of what's happening globally, but then whether we are getting that story right? Are we in the US, here in the United States, diagnosing China global correctly? And if so, then what are the policy options that we have on the table in an effort to engage more extensively globally to compete with China effectively in different sectors, right? But then if not, how do we course correct, right? And how do we address policy considerations with a newfound understanding of what actually is happening in mind?
That's interesting because you've co-authored and edited a couple of books, testified before the Senate Foreign Relations a couple of weeks ago.
Mm-hmm.
Have you noticed anything that in your initial research from this new role that we may have the narrative wrong? A broader question. It seems, just reading the trade press in Washington, and I know it's its own little bubble, but there's very little focus on China, Latin America. It's all China, US, China, EU. Why is that? Is it just there's not enough bandwidth in Washington, or is there something else going on?
On the first question, I'm so recently arrived to SAIS that we haven't begun some of the in-depth work that we'll be doing on China Global. But in general, I think there are a lot of misconceptions about, the China Latin America dynamic or China Global in general, right? There are certain narratives that persist in Washington that may have been, had some degree of relevance perhaps 5-10 years ago, but now the relationship has evolved so considerably. It's ever evolving, right? It's changing. And so we have to keep up with the time. This is a different moment in the China-Latin America dynamic. It's one in which Latin America is demanding different things from China. It's one in which China is operating under different sorts of constraints and different strategies and interests. And how all of that intersects is really quite fundamental in terms of determining how this is going to continue to evolve, what the implications are for the region, and what the implications are for U.S. interests. So really, it's a matter of just sort of keeping up with things. The debt trap narrative has been one that has, persisted for many, many years across administrations. But now we're at a moment where, China, for instance, is not lending in major quantities to Latin America or other regions anymore, right? At one point we saw 40 billion in Chinese finance to Latin America and the Caribbean in 1 year, right? Now, in these past few years, it's been in the neighborhood of about 1 billion total, right, to the entirety of the region through a couple of different loans here and there. And so that's just one example, right, of how things are shifting, how that dynamic is changing, and how the strategies, right, of different companies, of the government itself, and of Latin American nations, the push factors, right, are shifting and are changing the overall dynamic. Why is China Latin America not covered with enough frequency? I mean, there aren't that many people dedicated to this topic, right, in real depth. And so that's part of it, right? And despite, a lot of efforts on the part of the Inter-American Dialogue and now SAIS and many others to really dig deep into this topic, where you do see a lot of coverage, I think, of late on the trade front in particular is as concerns Mexico, right? And an understanding of Chinese engagement with Mexico, whether that's foreign direct investment or trade, The U.S. is concerned about this primarily because of an interest in understanding the extent to which China is using the USMCA and investment and presence in Mexico as a sort of backdoor or a way to avoid tariffs that have been placed on Chinese goods. I think is an issue of interest, has received some coverage, and will continue to be of focus as we move into the review process for the USMCA in 2026. Certainly, it will be on the table. And then there are a handful of other issues too. And this has always been the case with the China-Latin America relationship, right? It's not as though the relationship as a whole has been covered in considerable depth, but there are a couple of sort of hot topic issues that tend to feature, that tend to surface, especially in U.S. media, with some frequency. So trade in the context of the USMCA, right, is one of those. I think also any sort of projects that have considerable national security or sort of strategic relevance. The port that was proposed in Ushuaia, for example, right, Chancay Port in Peru has received considerable sort of media and broader government, U.S. government and other attention based on the prospect of it being used for having dual use capability, right, both military and civilian use capabilities. There are other sort of relationships that tend to receive a lot of attention. China's relations with Venezuela, for example, China's relations with Nicaragua. And then other sort of large-scale infrastructure projects have also featured rather prominently. More recently, we've seen quite a lot of attention on space cooperation, right, and other areas of technological cooperation that have implications both from a national security perspective, but also in terms of U.S. competitiveness. There are, on occasion, quite a few stories, but I agree that this dynamic doesn't receive necessarily the attention that it ought to.
So kind of going back to the point you made about kind of U.S. policy engagement in especially South America, but also Latin America. Obviously, a lot of focus under Trump 1 was renegotiating NAFTA, USMCA. But then, my sense is the U.S. has had a number of false starts with its policy engagement especially with South America. Going back to even TPP, then you had, what was it, APEP? We had how many, restarts of that? You kind of took that head on in your testimony a couple of weeks ago before the U.S. Senate. Walk us through your kind of the key points you were trying to impart on the members and policy recommendations that you have for, if I may, positive U.S. engagement in South America.
There are very different views, obviously, in Washington at the moment of how best to continue with our, or to frame our relations, with and carry out our relations with the Latin American region. There's been, I think, a reliance of late on using force in many cases, right, to achieve certain objectives vis-a-vis China. One example is engagement with Panama, even a threat to take back the Panama Canal, but which drew some concessions from Panama regarding Chinese presence on either side of the Panama Canal and sort of port access facilities, right, that have been managed by Hutchinson Whampoa there for decades, and which are now being run by BlackRock, as we know, right? There are other concessions that have won very recently in Chile, which decided to shut down a space sort of facility that China was developing there at the behest of the U.S. after the U.S. had expressed considerable concerns about China's potential use of that facility for purposes that would threaten U.S. national security and potentially also broader regional national security. So there are a lot of efforts, I think, at this particular juncture to really, use what leverage the U.S. has to draw concessions from countries on issues of concern vis-a-vis China. It's been quite effective, right? At least in the short term. But longer term progress, right? Longer term U.S. interests will be amplified by more extensive engagement in the region. And I think this is something that a lot of, administrations have understood. Making that happen is harder sometimes. Where it has been happening, right, is in the area of foreign assistance. And I believe that to be, in the scheme of things, right, a very low-cost way to achieve wide-ranging objectives. The effects of these objectives, right, are sometimes difficult to measure, and that's some of the challenge that, that the institutions that carry these out are struggling to make those arguments, right, at this particular juncture, whether as concerns health or education or broader economic stability or, the wide-ranging things that are good for the region, but then by extension are good for the hemisphere, whether in terms of, ensuring that everybody is on good footing, which can affect migration flows in a way that lessens the impact on the United States and other countries, making sure that the democratic institutions are solid and sound and able to navigate, the wide-ranging challenges that all of these countries, including our own, are going to be facing, in the coming years, the wide-ranging, health, economic, climate-related, and other uncertainties that are coming our way. This is in all of our best interest, right? And so that was another critical point, I think, was that engagement in using all of the tools that we have at our disposal. Certainly, I spoke earlier about our security cooperation, which is fundamental, but then wide-ranging other forms of development assistance are also a very big part of this equation, and one that the United States has really excelled at over the years, not just in the Latin American region, but globally. So all of this has to factor and contributes considerably to our soft power and in many ways to other, security related and other objectives that we have here at home. There's that, right? Beyond this, I think we need to think really critically and creatively about how we foster regional economic prosperity in ways that are both beneficial to the United States and U.S. interests, right? But that also strengthen our ties, our economic linkages to the region, that fortify those, and that make us more competitive, right? With China, which has established expansive economic ties in the region, has made promises of more in the way of supply chain integration, which has materialized in some instances and not so much in others, but which, has retained and continues to grow its influence, right, through these various mechanisms. And so without doing the same and without thinking strategically, critically, creatively about how to achieve the same, when we have a very different way of engaging the region than China does. We rely heavily on our private sector to do so much of this engagement, whereas China also relies on its companies, but its companies are operating most often, right, at the direction of government and party bodies. And so there is, that was another, I think, point that I sought to communicate. I think there are a lot of really new and creative ideas. Some of these not so new. Many have been proposed for many years, but this would be a moment to really take them very seriously, right? There's a lot, I think, that the Development Finance Corporation can do were it to act more as a development bank, right, on behalf of the United States, to put down some real capital. It doesn't have to be, all of its capital, but some capital to get things moving, and then to crowd in other sources of capital from partnerships that are longstanding, that would be supportive of U.S. and other interests and regional interests, right, in the region, including in critical sectors that we could identify, right, such as critical minerals development and supply chain development in that area, right, and renewable energy or critical infrastructure, as the case may be. So crowding in Inter-American Development Bank resources, CAF Development Bank of Latin America resources, and know-how, right, in terms of carrying out a lot of these projects would do much, I think, to advance U.S. interests, but also bolster Latin American competitiveness and Latin America's ability to feature at all, right, in these frontier industries, which, at the moment, it's looking as though Latin America will be left out of this equation entirely.
So you meant carrot and stick approach. As you noted, we've seen a lot of stick, threats of tariffs on and off. I guess setting Mexico and Canada aside because their economies are so intricately linked to the U.S. economy. But for the rest of Latin America, do you have concerns for the long term with China's, investment engagement in that area? And then does the U.S. have the leverage it thinks it has in the long term? You mentioned regional integration. You've got a few members of Latin America that are part of TPP, something the U.S. pulled out of, 2017. How does this play out in the long term if the U.S., continues to only use the stick approach and doesn't look at some of these other, incentives and corporations as they continue to cut back on USAID and other programs?
Yeah. I think that's a critical question, right? There, as I mentioned, the stick approach has drawn some concessions, right? But over-reliance on this, especially in the medium to long term, will erode U.S. credibility, trust in the U.S., right, and our overall leverage. Because the U.S. is, no longer, in some cases, even the main economic partner for certain countries, especially in South America. So in many cases, I think we are overestimating the amount of leverage that we have, especially at a moment when Latin America has diversified its economic partnerships and is looking to do more of that, noting that the U.S. is pulling back in areas where it has, traditionally engaged, especially on the area of, overseas development assistance, right? But also, in many cases is using the trade relationships that it has and especially with those countries that have established over time free trade agreements with the US, right, to draw additional concessions from those particular countries, from those countries which have trusted the US, have sought to, strengthen, especially trade related and other partnerships with the US, are now feeling the effects of that, negative consequences of some of those linkages. And so the lesson for the region is one of, really looking to diversify its partnerships further to avoid, the negative consequences that they may face if the U.S. continues to put the sort of pressure on the region that it has already. For most countries in the region, they look at China very opportunistically, right? And are hoping for more in the way of engagement. At the same time, they are increasingly wide-eyed, about what China can and cannot do at this juncture and some of the consequences of possible projects gone wrong, right, that China has carried out in the region. They're clear-eyed about this is probably the better term, right? And so if anything, this is a moment when the U.S. can engage constructively to demonstrate that it has something else, an alternative vision, an alternative approach that it can bring to bear in support of U.S. interests, certainly, but also broader regional interests. I think there would be even more reception to this notion than there has been in the past, given the experiences that Latin America has had with China over the past few decades. I mean, this approach has worked, right, on a couple of issues, but for how long?
A lot of the U.S. focus, at least, the Trump administration, is on kind of balance of trade of goods. And the reciprocal tariff proposals are, again, looking at goods. I'm just curious, is there a bigger issue out there that maybe is kind of off the radar with regards to technology, AI development, services? How do you see that playing out? Because, we're not in a static environment.
Not at all. And if we are looking to compete with China, right, this is a moment when China is focusing intensively on, precisely those sectors that the US and Europe and Japan and others, right, have identified as sectors that they too are prioritizing, right, that they hope to really achieve major advancements in the coming years to be competitive globally. A lot of this, as you mentioned, Jake, this is services, right, or is high technology, right, that is in many cases, directly related or integrated with these services. And so what we see now is a major promotion in the Latin American region through wide-ranging incentives by the Chinese government of companies that are establishing in Latin America and or trading with Latin America in frontier sectors. And real progress in these areas, whether it's of considerable benefit to the Latin American region or not, right, is something else that can be debated. But real progress for China in these areas that will position China in a way that is potentially advantageous and, degrade, not that this all has to be zero sum, but degrade, U.S. competitiveness in the region, certainly, but also globally. So much of what China is doing in the region is about acquiring data, right, to feed artificial intelligence. And in other cases, it's about establishing markets, right, to offload wide-ranging excess capacity in high-tech sectors that have been prioritized. And it's doing so effectively. Once those markets are established, often corresponding standards are adopted. This creates pathways for new technologies to be imported, right? There's a certain path dependency that accompanies this. And so this is really a critical juncture. It's either we engage in the region on these issues, right, and look to compete through, private equity, through a sovereign wealth fund of the sort that's been proposed potentially, or other, creative mechanisms, incentivizing U.S. companies and partner companies in some cases, right, to engage more extensively in both goods and services, trade and investment, right, or we don't. But I'll say that for China, because so many markets are closed off in the so-called global north, right? Latin America, Africa, other parts of the global south have become of increasing importance. And so they are, in many cases, a new frontier, a new battlefield, for lack of a better term, right, in competitiveness in emerging technologies and frontier industries. And so either we're present or we're not, even though I think all recognize that it's exceedingly difficult to compete with China, given the incentives that are put forth and the subsidies in particular that China employs in support of its companies.
So along those lines is kind of, and this is consistent what we continue to hear from our other podcast guests, is the real fight's going to be in the global south. That's the new market. It's not U.S., China directly, but in these third world markets. What advice do you have for businesses, especially U.S. businesses, but global businesses, as they look to enter and compete in, say, South America or even, Africa?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a matter of looking potentially beyond some of the legislation that was put forth by the Biden administration, right? Maybe some of that will survive, right? Will continue to feature some of these efforts, especially to develop new capacity at home, right? But also to develop supply chains overseas. But in general, I think, it's going to be a matter of working with this administration and with this within the understanding very well the viewpoints of this administration as concerns China's engagement in Latin America and U.S. engagement in Latin America, and U.S. companies positioning themselves within that context. I understand how vague that that answer is, but essentially, it's my view, and I'd be curious whether your other guests, share this view or not, or whether you do too, Jake. But my sense when looking at the China-Latin America dynamic in particular, right, is that, previous administrations, including, Trump 1, have seen this as a competitiveness problem, right, as economic competitiveness problem of China making advances, for example, in 5G and other telecoms and other areas where the U.S. and partner nations have sought to compete and have done so not particularly successfully in Latin America to date. This time around, my sense is that this relationship is being viewed mostly through a national security lens, with less overall emphasis on private sector competitiveness and U.S. competitiveness in these industries, and on, the development of regional supply chains to achieve certain objectives. I think much to our detriment, right, in the longer term. So if we think about Chancai, why is Chancai of so much focus? It's because of its prospect for dual use, of the possibility for using it for military purposes in the event of a future military contingency, whether that's related to Taiwan or otherwise, right? Why are China's ICT and other efforts of concern? Because of the prospect for surveillance, right? Why are space-related engagements of concern? Because of the possibility for monitoring what the U.S. is doing, right, in these certain areas. And all of this is related to sort of more national security and military concerns than anything else. My sense is that U.S. companies really need to take this lens into account, right? When making arguments, competitiveness is fundamental, right? Even in the event of some sort of broader confrontation. But if this is what's really driving so much of the activity, right, and is the primary concern, then framing all of these sort of commercial interests with this in mind, I think will be absolutely fundamental. So if we look at the Panama Canal decision, right, and we look at what BlackRock managed, right, that negotiation, right, was conducted really with these national security concerns top of mind, right? And so BlackRock stepped into a void, right, that was created when Panama's work with Hutchinson Whampoa, which is a Hong Kong-based company, right, was challenged, and did so at just the right moment, right? And so finding those areas where, with business and commercial interests in mind, companies can also support what appears to be a priority national security agenda will be, I think, quite fundamental at this particular juncture.
While also trying to stay out of the crosshairs of China.
Absolutely.
Since you asked me, as I kind of look back under Trump 1, it's interesting that most of the security aspects have carried over through Biden and into Trump 2. Just to call out, the information communications technology services, the ICTS rules that came out of, the first Trump presidency. The Huawei export control bans for them and ZTE, again, from Trump and then carried over. So I think you're absolutely right until it changes. I think that's, from the sense I get, that's kind of the uncertainty of, again, what is the administration's policy going to be long-term vis-a-vis with China? And until we have an agreement or a change, I think, it's just more uncertainty, and we have to assume that that's the linear path of security first, economic second. But
yeah,
at the same time, we've heard from some of our guests, the U.S. has to be careful on going too far in the security side, because a lot of the products and services are global in nature, and there's the opportunity for backfilling from other countries who aren't adhering to the same type of export controls. It's a thorny mess.
It's a thorny mess, and also so many of these measures over the past few years, right, have incentivized or I think catalyzed China's own efforts to develop its domestic capabilities in this respect, right? And so it's not as though all of this isn't without externalities in various forms. Yeah.
So economics still applies, first, second, third order effects of every decision.
Absolutely.
So Margaret, this has been an incredibly insightful conversation. As we wrap up, what final thoughts would you share with our audience on the future of U.S. Latin America relations and China's role in the hemisphere?
I would just reinforce the point that China-Latin America relations is ever evolving. China's abilities, its interests, right, are constantly changing, and that in the Latin American region, right, and globally. And so any understanding, U.S. policy needs to be accommodating of that, right? Needs to be nimble. And I think often, in seeing the moves that we make, either they are neglecting entirely kind of what China is doing in the region, or they're operating according to a reality of, 5 years ago, potentially, right? And so we need to be nimble. We need to be up to date. China also needs to understand, and Latin America needs to understand the lens through which, just as we discussed, right, the U.S. is viewing all of this, which is also ever evolving. And so it's a thorny mess, as you mentioned, right? But it's also something that we all need to keep abreast of. I've said for many years that, there are kind of three things happening in the China-Latin America dynamic. One, and this continues, right? But it shifts within these frameworks, right? So the first is that we are seeing a decline, a tapering in the overall value, right, of Chinese engagement in the region. So it's not as though we're seeing this boom, but at the same time, economic engagement, that is, right? So foreign direct investment in particular, but also finance. At the same time, we're seeing a focusing. So even though we're seeing a decline in the value of Chinese economic engagement in the region, we're seeing more projects in very specific sectors. And it's precisely those sort of frontier industries that China has identified as absolutely fundamental to its economic growth prospects that are the focus in the Latin American context, right? And so that's what companies need to understand. They know this already, right? And that's certainly what the U.S. government needs to understand. And then at the same time, the third, I think, is localization. And we see this more and more every day, right? More efforts to engage at the local level, not just in capital cities, but in small towns where, there may be resources, there may be some sort of interesting infrastructure deal, strategic infrastructure deal, right, that is worth pursuing and developing relationships to facilitate even 10, 20 years from now. So these things continue apace, regardless of whether the U.S. chooses to engage more extensively. And watching these trends, how they're evolving, will be absolutely fundamental looking ahead.
it strikes me as companies are looking to go global, they have to be local. So that's a great tagline. Margaret, thank you so much for your time. And everybody, thank you for tuning in to the Basilinna podcast. This is Coffee, Trade, and Tech. Hope to see you soon. Margaret, would love to have you back for another podcast in the future.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to Tholos Talks, a series by the Basilinna Institute. Available on Spotify, YouTube, and SoundCloud. Make sure to follow and subscribe to our channels to stay up to date on upcoming episodes. To learn more about these topics or the work we're doing, visit the Basilinna website.